Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining CyPAR's 2021 Cal-Peculiarities Series 3 Independent Contractor Intricacies webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the program, please use the Q&A section located on the right side of your WebEx window. We will do our best to get to everyone's questions, and we'll follow up with you via email if we do not have a chance to address your questions during the webinar. Additionally, if there is time left at the end of the webinar, we will be holding a short Q&A session. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it is required for CLE credit. CLE credit submission instructions, the presentation recording, and the slide deck will be distributed to attendees in the days following this presentation. Next slide, please. My name is Pamela Vartabedian, and I'm a partner in CyPAR Shaw's San Francisco office. I will be presenting today with my colleague and partner, Eric Lloyd, who's also in the San Francisco office. I focus a significant portion of my practice litigating complex wage and hour collective and class actions arising under federal and state law, and I also litigate single plaintiff matters and provide day-to-day preventative advice and counseling on a wide range of employment law issues, including independent contractor misclassification and joint employment issues. Eric's practice focuses as well on single plaintiff litigation, including discrimination, harassment, and retaliation cases, and wage and hour class actions. In particular, Eric is an expert in independent contractor, misclassification, and joint employment issues. Next slide. I'd like to just take a quick moment here to ask everyone to review the disclaimer, which serves as a reminder that this presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Next slide. So today's agenda, we're going to be covering a number of topics, starting with an overview of AB5, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with at this point, but I'll just provide an overview of AB5 and how we got there as a refresher back to the Dynamics case back in 2018. We'll next go into the meat of our discussion, which is really talking about AB 2257, which repealed and replaced AB5 last year. It seems to have flown under the radar when it was passed last year in the middle of the pandemic. So we'll spend some time talking about how AB 2257, the current law, is different from AB5, focusing on revised exemptions under AB 2257. And then we'll be finishing up today with a discussion of where things stand now, and we'll talk a little bit about Prop 22 at the end. Next slide. Okay, so as a refresher, I'll take you back to April 2018, which seems like forever ago right now. The California Supreme Court handed down the Dynamics decision, which was an independent contractor misclassification case, where the court considered whether the common law control test, which comes from the 1989 case of Referral, or a new test should be used to determine whether a worker is properly classified as an employee or an independent contractor. In the context of the California wage orders, the court in Dynamics held that the Borello test did not apply, but that this more stringent ABC test applies. Now, under the ABC test, it is presumed that a worker hired to perform services for a hiring entity is an employee of the hiring entity unless the hiring entity provides three factors, which are A, the worker is free from control and direction of the hirer in connection with performing the work under both the contract and in fact, and B, the worker performs work outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business, and C, the worker customarily engages in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as the work performed for the hirer. Under the ABC test, if the hiring entity fails to establish any one of these three factors, then the worker is an employee and not an independent contractor. Now, this was quite a shift then, because the ABC test is very different from the common law or multi-factor test under Borello. The common law or Borello test looks at a number of factors in determining a worker's classification, the principal factor being control, whether the hiring entity has the right to control the manner and means of accomplishing the result. Under the Borello test, no single factor is determinative. It's a much more flexible test than the ABC test, where each element must be met. Notably, under dynamics, the court held that the ABC test applies to California wage order claims, but for non-wage order claims, the Borello test still applies, like labor code claims, for example. Now, all this changed once AB 5 was passed. So for work performed on or after January 1st, 2020, AB 5 codified the ABC test and expanded the reach of the ABC test to cover not only wage order claims, but labor code and unemployment insurance claims. So that was quite a broad change at that time. AB 5 exempted a hodgepodge of occupations from the ABC test. For example, commercial fishermen, newspaper distributors, financial advisors, certain manicurists and barbers, freelance writers, newspaper cartoonists, but only if they had no more than 35 submissions per year. So for those occupations that were exempted from AB 5, the common law or Borello test applies to assess whether a worker is an employee or independent contractor. So to be clear, if a worker is exempt from the ABC test, the worker is not automatically an independent contractor or an employee, but you have to look at the Borello test to determine the status of the worker. Now, given that under AB 5, some industries were governed by the more relaxed Borello standard, while others faced the less flexible ABC test, the California legislature was intensely lobbied to create more exemptions to the ABC test. Next slide, please. So AB 2257 is a result of that lobbying. So effective September 4th, 2020, AB 2257 repealed and replaced AB 5. So what's different now? A lot of AB 2257 mirrors AB 5, but there are important changes to note. That's what we're going to be discussing for the majority of this webinar. So AB 2257 maintained the ABC test and the types of claim to which it applies. The ABC test still applies to work performed on or after January 1st, 2020, and it still exempts the same occupations from the ABC test as AB 5 did, but it purportedly clarifies some of the exemptions and added a few new ones, which we'll go into. As with AB 5, the exemptions in AB 2257 still apply retroactively, and as with AB 5, if a worker is exempt from the ABC test, the Borello test still applies to determine if the worker is an employee or independent contractor. But AB 2257 beefed up enforcement mechanisms as it empowers district attorneys, not only attorney generals and some city attorneys, to bring actions for injunctive relief to prevent continued misclassification. Next slide. So I'd like to just pause for a moment to say that it's probably not surprising if you're familiar with AB 5, but AB 2257 is similarly very dense and convoluted. So today we're going to attempt to give you a very broad overview of the law here. We'd be here for hours if we went into every little intricacy. So should you have specific questions or want to have a deeper discussion about AB 2257 or a particular industry that we touch on today, please feel free to reach out to either Eric or I. Okay, so what is new under AB 2257? There is now a single engagement business-to-business exemption. So this exemption is for individual business persons who contract with one another for purposes of providing services at the location of a single engagement event. Now, provided certain criteria are met, including a lack of control over the work, a written contract specifying payment amounts, and each individual's maintenance of his or her business location, among others, the ABC test will not apply where one individual contracts with another to perform services at a single engagement event. So you may ask, what is a single engagement event? It is defined under the statute as not only a standalone, non-recurring event in a single location, but also a series of events in the same location no more than once a week. AB 2257 also creates several new exemptions for the entertainment industry, primarily in the music industry. So there are a number of occupations listed in AB 2257 in connection with creating, marketing, promoting, or distributing sound recordings or musical compositions. Again, these occupations are exempt from the ABC test, so you'll be looking at the Borello test in determining if a worker is properly classified as an independent contractor. There are, of course, a couple of nuances to the exemptions to note. First, musicians and vocalists who do not receive royalties from a sound recording or musical composition must be paid the applicable minimum and overtime wages as though they were employees. Second, musicians and musical groups engaged in a concert are exempt from the ABC test unless they, A, perform a symphony orchestra or in a musical theater production or at a theme park or amusement park, B, are an event headliner in a venue with more than 1,500 attendees, or C, perform at a festival that sells more than 18,000 tickets per day. Finally, individual performance artists, including but not limited to comedians, improvisers, magicians, and illusionists who perform original work they create, will qualify for an exemption so long as they are free from the hirer's control, retain the intellectual property rights related to their performance, set their terms of work and negotiate their rates, and are free to accept or reject each engagement without being penalized by the hiring entity. There are also a handful of additional miscellaneous exemptions under AB 2257, subject to certain requirements for the following occupations: manufacturing, housing, salespersons, certain individuals engaged by international exchange visitor programs, and competition judges, including amateur umpires and referees. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to creating the new exemptions I just discussed, AB 2257 also expands some of the exemptions that were already included in AB 5, including the professional services exemption. So this one should sound familiar because this was, again, in AB 5. Under the professional services exemption, certain professions are exempt from the ABC test if they meet a number of conditions. I think there's about 6 conditions. These are all set forth in AB 2257, and they are very similar to what was in AB 5. And some of them have been further expanded under AB 2257. So I'm not going to go through the 6 requirements to save some time here, but they are very similar to AB 5 and are all set forth in this statute. The biggest change is that AB 2257 expands the list of occupations that may qualify under the professional services exemption. And so what they add to the list, there's already a long list, and have now added client contributors, advisors, producers, narrators, or cartographers for certain publications, provided they do not displace existing employees, specialized performers hired to teach a class for no more than a week, appraisers, registered professional foresters, and home inspectors. Notably, AB 2257 also eliminates the cap of 35 submissions in AB 5 as related to the journalism photography industry. Whereas AB 5 limited the number of submissions that independent contractors in this industry could publish in a single form without sacrificing their contractor status, AB 2257 removes the submission cap and instead requires that businesses refrain from displacing existing employees in order to utilize one of these types of contractors. Okay, so before I pass this over to Eric, I would also like to touch on the referral agency exemption briefly, and Eric will go into more detail. So this is an exemption that also existed under AB 5. But AB 2257 includes numerous clarifications about the referral agency exemption. So really quickly, what is a referral agency? It is a business that connects end users or clients, as I call them, with individuals operating as a sole proprietorship or business entity, which is often referred to as a service provider. This exemption may exempt from the ABC test a relationship between the referral agency and the service provider if a number of conditions are met. And so there are 11 conditions set forth in the statute, which Eric will talk about, and he'll also discuss how they have changed under AB 2257. The biggest changes under AB 5, a referral agency was defined narrowly as a business that connects clients with service providers that provide specific services, and that was limited to graphic design, photography, tutoring, event planning, minor home repair, moving, home cleaning, errands, furniture assembly, animal services, dog walking, dog grooming, web design, picture hanging, pool cleaning, or yard cleanup. Now, AB 2257 expands the referral agency exemption significantly and expressly applies this exemption to a non-exclusive list of additional services that were not included under AB 5, including consulting, youth sports, coaching, caddying, wedding, event planning services, services provided by wedding and event vendors, and interpreting services. But again, the list appears to be non-exclusive, so other services may qualify under this exemption. Okay, I'm going to now pass this off to Eric to talk more about what's new with the referral agency exemption. To also discuss the business-to-business exemption, which is a big one, and we'll give you some insight as to where things stand now. And then he'll pass it back to me to quickly wrap up with Prop 22. All right, Eric.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, everybody. We go to the next slide, please. Looks like we're there. Never mind. Don't need to advance the slides. Pam talked a little bit about the referral agency and how it was expanded, and I'm now going to talk about how the criteria for its application has changed as a result of AB 2257. So the referral agency exemption may apply to the relationship between a quote-unquote service provider and a company that refers out his or her services to clients. The catch is that the exemption only applies if 11 separate criteria are met. AB 2257 makes some important changes to that criteria. First up, AB 2257 now requires that the service provider certify that he or she possesses all licenses, tax registrations, or permits required by law. And the referral agency must keep those certifications on file for at least 3 years. Second up, AB 5 previously provided that a service provider had to have an independent business that does the same type of work that he or she performs for the client of the referral agency. And AB 2257 tweaked this a little bit. Now, as a result of AB 2257, a service provider may qualify for the exemption if their business performs work that is related to the services performed for the client, but not necessarily the same kind of work. Also, a service provider can still qualify for the exemption if they previously had a business that did the same type of work they're performing for the end client of the referral agency. Another thing AB 2257 does is grant more flexibility with respect to the service provider's terms of work and hours. Under AB 5, the previous law, the service provider had to have complete control over both the terms of service and the hours that he or she worked in order for the exemption to apply. And now, as a result of AB 2257, the service provider can negotiate the terms of work and hours with the client. So a little more flexibility there. Another thing AB 2257 has done is to loosen up the terms regarding these service providers' rates. AB 2257 clarifies that service providers can negotiate their rates directly with a client or with the client through the referral agency. Also, AB 2257 provides that the service provider can accept or reject rates set by the client. That's pretty different from AB 5, which required that the service provider have total control over his or her rates for the exemption to apply. And then finally, there's a potentially significant change to the referral agency exemption that does not impact the availability of the exemption. As a result of AB 2257, the ABC test will determine whether a, quote, individual worker is an employee of the service provider or of the client that the service provider is working for. So we're left to wonder, what exactly does that mean? It's not entirely clear because we don't know precisely what lawmakers meant by individual worker. And so we'll have to wait for courts to interpret that language before we have anything definitive to pass on to you. My take is that the term individual workers refers to workers engaged by the service provider. And I think the effect of this language will turn on whether the, quote, individual workers are employees or independent contractors of the service provider. The reason for this is that there are a number of cases holding that the ABC test only applies to workers who are classified as independent contractors. So following the logic of those cases, the ABC test should not apply to employees of a service provider in the referral agency scenario. There's obviously no need for an employment test when it comes to a worker's relationship with a service provider in that scenario. And when it comes to a worker's relationship with a client, it would seem that the test for joint employment rather than the test for independent contractor misclassification should apply. On the other hand, if the worker is an independent contractor of the service provider, then it seems the ABC test is going to apply to that relationship. And what AB 2257 seems to say is that the ABC test will also apply to the relationship between the worker and client, which did not engage the worker in the first place. So a little murky there. Hopefully we'll get some clarification soon. We can go to the next slide, please. Some more significant changes to another pretty significant exemption that was in AB5 that raised a lot of questions, the business-to-business exemption. Generally speaking, the business-to-business exemption may apply when two businesses contract with one another and where the service provider is an individual operating as a sole proprietor, partnership, corporation, LLC, or LLP. One thing that AB 2257 has done is clarify that the exemption applies only where one of the businesses is an individual rather than a large company. And if a long list of criteria is satisfied, then the ABC test will not apply to that individual service provider who's operating as a standalone business. So let's go through some of the changes to the criteria for the business-to-business exemption. First off, under AB5, the service provider could not, under any circumstances, provide services to the other business's customers, or else the exemption would not apply. Now, under AB 2257, the service provider can do so, can provide services to the contracting business's customers, and still qualify for the exemption, as long as two conditions are met. First up, the service provider's employees must perform the services for the customer under the name of the service provider. What does that mean? In other words, if the service provider, Joe Inc., to use a colloquial phrase there, signs a contract with Mega Corporation, Joe Inc. can provide services to Mega Corporation's customers so long as Joe Inc.'s employees are not held out to be employees of Mega Corporation. And then second, the service provider must regularly contract with other businesses. Another change to the B2B exemption criteria, AB 2257 requires that the contract between the two businesses must specify the payment amount, the rate of pay, and the payment due date. That's all new. None of that was in AB5. And then in a good development, AB 2257 loosens up AB5's requirement that the service provider must actually contract with multiple businesses in order to qualify for the exemption. AB 2257 now provides that the service provider need not contract with other businesses as long as they can maintain a clientele without any restrictions. And then finally, a significant change that doesn't affect whether the exemption is available, and it's very similar to the discussion we just had a moment ago about the individual worker in the referral agency context. AB 2257 now provides that where the business-to-business exemption applies, the ABC test will determine whether an individual worker, there's that phrase again, who is not acting as a sole proprietor or through a business entity, is an employee or independent contractor of the service provider or of the contracting business. So once again, we're left asking, what does that actually mean? And again, we'll need to see how courts interpret that language. What it appears to mean is that if the service provider has workers and those workers are independent contractors, then the ABC test is going to determine whether the workers are not only employees of the service provider, but also of the contracting business. So in other words, the ABC test may be applied to both businesses in the business-to-business scenario, and that's even though the contracting business never classified those workers as independent contractors in the first place. So if you're contracting out for services, you want to pay close attention to whether your contractors are using employees or independent contractors themselves. Next slide, please. So a lot has happened in a fairly short amount of time, and some of you are probably going a little bit crazy trying to keep straight what's what and which test applies to what claims and during what time period. So I thought it'd be helpful to break things down a little bit. First off, AB 2257, which again replaced AB5, applies to all work performed on or after January 1, 2020. So the ABC test is going to be the default test for all work performed on or after January 1, 2020. And that will apply to all claims brought under the California Labor Code, California Wage Orders, or the California Unemployment Insurance Code. Second of all, the California Supreme Court has recently ruled that the Dynamics decision, which installed the ABC test for the first time in California law, is retroactive. That means that the ABC test is going to apply to all claims arising only from the California wage orders in any non-final litigation, regardless of when the claims accrued. And finally, non-wage order claims arising before January 1, 2020, when AB5 took effect, are subject to the common law test for employment articulated in the California Supreme Court's Referral decision. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Pam.
All right, thanks, Eric. So we will finish off by quickly running through and discussing Prop 22, which I'm sure many of you are aware of and are probably quite familiar with it at this point. So who's covered under the law, and then I'll talk about the benefits that are provided. So first, Prop 22 exempts certain network companies from AB 5, AB 2257. This means that certain companies that engage workers covered by Prop 22 do not have to deal with the dreaded and stringent ABC test in order to properly classify certain workers as independent contractors. So who does it cover? It may not be as expansive as some may wish. So Prop 22 covers app-based drivers who either A, provide delivery services on an on-demand basis through a business's online-enabled application or platform, too often referred to as DNCs, delivery network companies, or B, use a personal vehicle to provide prearranged transportation services for compensation via a business's online-enabled application or platform, or TNCs. So practically speaking, this means that it appears that Prop 22 applies pretty narrowly to delivery and rideshare drivers for network companies. Also, Prop 22 only classifies such workers as independent contractors if the following requirements are also met. So the network companies must not unilaterally prescribe specific dates, times of days, or minimum number of hours during which the drivers must be logged into the app or platform. The network companies must not require the driver to accept any specific ride shares or delivery service requests as a condition of maintaining access to the app or platform. The network companies must not restrict the driver from performing rideshare delivery services for other network companies, except when the driver is working for the network company. And they also must not restrict the driver from working in any other lawful occupation or business. Next slide. So let's talk about the benefits that are provided under Prop 22 real quick. So for drivers who work at least 15 hours a week of engaged time, which Eric will talk about, a health care subsidy consistent with the average contributions required under the Affordable Care Act, a new minimum earnings guaranteed tied to 120% of minimum wage with no maximum. They also get compensation for vehicle expenses, so that's mileage compensation for engaged miles, occupational accident insurance to cover on-the-job injuries, and protection against discrimination and sexual harassment. Now, all of this is set forth in the Business and Professions Code, where many definitions can also be found, but there, of course, remain many open questions. And I will pass this over to Eric to finish this off and talk about some of the open questions from Prop 22.
All right, thank you, Pam. Okay, so a lot remains open as far as Proposition 22 goes because it is pretty new and not many courts have interpreted it extensively. So for instance, one of the biggest questions that remains about Prop 22 and its impact, what does engaged time mean? You may recall from what Pam just mentioned, engaged time in part factors into how much money the contractors must make in order to qualify for the minimum wage requirement. Engaged time is defined in the Business and Professions Code as the period of time as recorded in a network company's online-enabled platform or application from when an app-based driver accepts a rideshare request or delivery request to when the app-based driver completes that rideshare request or delivery request. Important to note, though, that engaged time does not include any time spent performing a rideshare service or delivery service after the request has been canceled by the customer, or any time spent on a rideshare service or delivery service where the app-based driver abandons performance of the service prior to completion. So at first that seems straightforward enough, but one of the big questions remaining is, what does that mean for jobs that are requested far in advance and are accepted by the driver? Still somewhat of an open question. We're not sure how courts are going to interpret that, and regulatory agencies such as the CPUC may weigh in as well. So we'll have to keep our eyes open for developments on that front. That said, as a best practice, companies should define engaged time and what it means for users of their platform and make sure that that definition is consistent with the company's other policies, such as their insurance policies and their treatment of what engaged time means. Another open question, is Proposition 22 retroactive? In other words, does it apply to independent contractors who performed work prior to the effective date of the proposition becoming law? This question comes up a lot. We don't have a clear answer yet. Nothing in the text says that Prop 22 is retroactive, but the issue is being litigated, and a number of companies are taking the position that it is retroactive. One case of note to keep an eye on, there is a case pending in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California before Judge Edward Chen, in which Judge Chen certified a class of more than 4,800 independent contractor drivers for a transportation network company. And in certifying that class, Judge Chen initially ruled that Proposition 22 did not apply retroactively. He then walked back that ruling in April of this year, and he agreed with the defendant's argument that retroactive application of Prop 22 was ultimately a question that shouldn't be decided at the class certification stage. It will be decided later on in the case. So still remains an open question in that case, still remains an open question across the board, and we'll have to see how litigation plays out before we get clarification on whether it operates retroactively. One other thing that's pending to take note of, the SEIU, Service Employees International Union, earlier this year filed a lawsuit directly with the California Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of Proposition 22. And the California Supreme Court declined to take up that case, rejected their petition without prejudice, which enabled the SEIU to then refile the case in trial court in Alameda County Superior Court, where that case is now pending. And there haven't been any significant activities of note in that case to date. It's one we're monitoring, and you'll want to keep your eyes on it because obviously a victory for the SEIU in that case would have a pretty significant impact on companies whose contractors fall within the purview of Proposition 22. And finally, another open question. Will this strategy of going to the voters and instead of going through the legislature be replicated in other states? Likely. Seemed to work well for the transportation network companies in California, knock on wood, pending the decision in the SEIU case and any subsequent litigation. But it does seem likely that we will see similar efforts in other states. Next slide, please. Okay, here's your CLE code. SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 7729. SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 7729. We can go to the next slide, please. So to wrap things up, wanted to let you know that we've had 2 sessions prior to this one in our California Peculiarities webinar series. You can find those on our website. And when you receive a copy of this slideshow, there should be a link to those webinars as well. We also have our 4th series coming up, Rounding and Meal Periods, on July 13th, next week at 1:00 p.m. So please register if you're interested in attending. Should be some good stuff in there. We can go to the next slide, please. Also want to let you know there are resources available to you if you have questions about California employment law. Obviously, Pam and I'd be happy to hear from you, but if you'd like some publications, we do have our California Peculiarities ebook publication. We also have a PDF of it for 2020. And you can also sign up for our mailing list or our employment law blogs. Next slide, please. Like I said, Pam and I'd be happy to hear from you if you have any further questions beyond this slideshow. And I think we do have a few minutes for Q&A, and it looks like we do have one question. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. We do have one question. I'll just go ahead and field it. Someone has asked, if the B2B exemption doesn't apply and the ABC test isn't satisfied, how do you treat a business entity, not an individual or sole proprietor, as an employee? This is a question that's troubled me since AB 5 was passed through the legislature. AB 5 and the B2B exemption specifically kind of turned the notion of a business entity on its head. Businesses that are incorporated or registered as an LLC or a partnership have an independent existence under the law from the individuals that own them. Sole proprietorship is a different story. Sole proprietor is the owner and the business, his or herself as well. But when you're dealing with a corporation or an LLC, for example, that business entity is supposed to have a separate legal existence. And the B2B exemption doesn't outright say it, but it does suggest that you can somehow pierce through that corporate veil and determine that a person who is affiliated with that business, whether it be the owner or someone else, can be treated as an independent contractor, even where the business entity is the contractor and not the person. The B2B exemption in AB 2257 clarifies that when you're dealing with essentially a one-person operation, an individual operating as a business, then the legislature has made the judgment that they want the court to examine whether that person is operating what in their judgment is a legitimate business. And if so, they can continue operating as a contractor. If not, then the ABC test will apply, and obviously that's a difficult threshold to meet. But when you're dealing with a company that is not comprised solely of an individual, that's a different question. We haven't seen it tested out in a court yet. There is all kinds of case law holding that businesses have a separate existence from their owners and rejecting claims by owners that are more properly brought by the business entity itself. But we have not seen that tested out since AB 5 took effect in January of last year. So another open issue that we'll want to keep watch for. And that's the one question we received. If you have any others, please feel free to reach out to Pam and me, and we'll be happy to answer. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.